The Banking Scene Director's Cut goes behind the scenes, sharing stories and insights to help you build the bank of tomorrow.
Welcome to this episode of the Banking Scene Director's Cut, where our special guest today is Remy Knecht, Head of Anti-Fraud Services at Isabel. Welcome to the show, Remy. Could you please, just to start out with, give the audience a bit of context about Isabel and about your role so that they know the angle that you're coming from with the insights that you're going to be sharing with us?
Thanks for having me on the show. So indeed, I'm heading the anti-fraud service department at Isabel. Isabel is already existing since 1995 for 30 years, and it's providing multi-banking services. So they started setting up a multi-banking payment platform between companies and banks that is a unique position. After that, they also launched new services on account information based on the PSD2 regulation, which is called POMTO. And very recently also in terms of, let's say, business wallets or business vaults, they launched QKYC with verified corporate data, just like you have that, as you might know, with digital identities for individuals. So we're starting now to also create those kind of corporate identities, and that is what QKYC is doing. And so today, Isabel is a company processing about 2.3 trillion euros a year. So that's 4 times about the GDP of Belgium. Is a lot. We service about 50,000 companies in a network of about 2,000 banks.
Okay, that's impressive figures there. And I'm glad that you had mentioned at the beginning about KYC and about verification of accounts and things like that, because that's actually one of the first questions that I've got for you, is that I know it's very early in only a couple of months into the regulation around verification of payee, IBAN name checks, that kind of a thing. But from your vantage point across Benelux payment flows, how have instant payments and the introduction of verification of payee changed the fraud landscape, both for corporates and SME clients and things like that? What's happened?
So I think there's good news and there's bad news there. The good news is, of course, with the verification of payee, the customers themselves, when they encode payments, they already get an indication whether an account is matching with the name of the payee, in fact. So pushing, in fact, the check already a bit upstream towards the customer, alerting them when something is not right. The bad news is, in fact, is that criminals already have found ways around this check. And to give you one example is, so some big companies like telcos sometimes work with collection agents, which have a different name and which act on behalf of a company. And so that's actually what we see happening with customers also. So they send mails to companies saying like, we are now going to work with an external agency. They even are that stealthy because they spoof sometimes even the domains of the suppliers, because if you look at the statistics on a cybersecurity point of view, about 70 to 75% of domains are not well protected for spoofing. So that means that you could receive a mail from the legitimate domain, but not actually coming from a supplier. And then they're sending these messages to suppliers saying, okay, we're working with this external company now. And then they send the fake invoice where they didn't only change the IBAN number, but also the company name, which is then actually matching with the IBAN number, but which is a fake company, which they register somewhere in another country, sorry. So which means that the customer gets a green light on the verification of PE, giving a false sense of security. And so they say, well, the light is green, so it's all good. And they approve the transaction. So that's where we have to put in additional checks, because for these fake companies to register, they usually go to countries or, let's say, financial institutions that are quite suspicious for us, which are also are very favorable for criminals to set up accounts with weak KYC processes. So we have to perform other checks on top of the verification of PE, which is not sufficient enough.
So in actual fact, it's almost legitimizing those mule accounts in some instances. The verification of payee, as you say, is giving that false sense of security. That's a really tough one to try and combat in the fraud landscape. When you look at payment data across multiple banks and channels, what sort of behavioral or contextual signals tend to be the earliest and most reliable indicators of things like invoice fraud or CEO fraud or scam-induced behavior. Are there any signals that can be picked up?
Certainly. So where you see financial institutions still relying on classical single channel authentication, like username, password with even MFA, one-time code sending by SMS, these kind of methods are not very safe anymore, because you see criminal organizations using phishing websites, and until like 5-6 years ago, they still had to build them themselves. But if you go and have a look on the dark web or on Telegram's channels, you will see that there are organizations renting these kind of infrastructure by the hour, by day, by week. And so you don't even have to have the technical knowledge to perform these kind of attacks anymore. But what you will see, of course, is that when that happens, the credentials are used on a different device, on a different location, maybe in different operating system. So getting that contextual information about where is this payment being encoded, is this still looking to historical data, like is this the usual devices or infrastructure that we see from the customer? That is a first indicator. Also for phishing, so in Belgium specifically, we have built in the last 5 years a lot of barriers for phishing. So through collaboration with telco providers, implementing anti-smishing systems on their mobile networks, for instance, to detect these links sending by SMS. Also, the Federal Center of Cybersecurity has such a unique proposition. In fact, in Belgium, they have a Belgian anti-fraud, anti-phishing shield, the BAPS system. And so we have the whole community of banks and telcos connected to that. So if someone detects a phishing domain, it's propagated throughout the system and put on a bad list, which is connected to the telco networks. And so when another customer would serve to that bad domain, they will get a red warning screen like, this is a malicious domain. Prevents a lot of bad traffic. And so what we see, in fact, is a shift towards social engineering, because the phishing is not working as well as anymore. So that's where we see that the criminals are actually calling the victim, pretending to be a help desk of the bank or from the supplier, and trying to get the customer to perform the transactions themselves, which is harder to detect. So, and there we are also putting things in place and working with telco providers, because telcos typically see those signals that a call is ongoing. So also there we have statistics that in 75% of those social engineering cases, especially for retail banking, you see a long call ongoing while or just before the transaction. Also in the UK, they did a study on that with Vodafone, with a lot of fraudulent cases from the banks, where they saw that indeed they could identify those long calls ongoing with customers. So that is an indication which we can also do. And then there's other things which have been prevalent already there for some time, like remote access tools. Very difficult, because it's a legitimate tool from your help desk. But if they get installed on a victim's PC, then criminals get access to your PC and can take over or perform actions. So there we are also working with remote access tool providers and so on, so the big ones, to provide a service where retail banks or customer banks, they can actually ask like, okay, for this customer, this device, do you see any active session on a remote access tool? So these are all kind of signals which we try to implement now. Also in corporate fraud, and that is important. So we have something new in Belgium. That's from the 1st of January for B2B invoices. It's mandatory to send electronic invoices through what we call the PEPL network. And that was first presented as a safer way to transmit invoices, and it is safe in transit. But what we found out, and that was recently in the press, is that the registration process to get access to a PEPL access point to send invoices, the KYC process of that is not very strong. So it's you don't have to be like a genius to impersonate a company and register yourself on a PEPL access point. And that means it becomes worse, because instead of now, as a criminal, I'm sending emails with one-on-one with victims and sending them fake invoices. Now I get an access network where I can send maybe hundreds or thousands of invoices, so at scale. So again, to the same point of what I said for verification of PE, the customer will say, hey, this invoice came in through PEPL in my ERP or accounting system, so it must be safe, but that's not a guarantee. So there you also get this safe false sense of security. And that's where we are broadening our services at Isabel, not only looking at anymore at atomic payments, but looking throughout the whole scale of the process, from the access points where the invoices come in, the registration of new supplier onboarding processes, so the beneficiary checking. So we're looking throughout the scheme even before the payments are encoded to see if there's anything in these invoices, looking historically through the link between the brand and the company name and the IBAN number, but also cross customers. So if we see like 9 customers having using the same supplier, we see one customer being targeted with a fake invoice, and we can actually see that there's an anomaly and alert that to that customer. So we're looking way broader than just the payments now. We're looking through the whole chain of events, from supplier onboarding, sending invoices, to the payments.
So clearly, collaboration is core to what you're doing there. There's a lot of data sharing that you're talking about in order to enable all of this. And we've had a lot of banks in the past, or a lot of people who work in banks, saying, oh, we wish we could collaborate more, but GDPR and certain privacy constraints prevent us from doing that. But what you're explaining clearly shows that there is an area that can be collaborated in and still stay within those national privacy constraints. So how are you enabling that? And obviously it's all done within the regulation, which is something that I think a lot of banks are not understanding at the moment, that it is possible, that maybe their compliance departments are preventing them. What sort of discussions are you having with banks when you go in and you say to them, this is possible and it can be done within GDPR and within privacy?
Well, in that area, we've seen in Belgium already a few attempts to set up such a collaboration, and it's a fraud intelligence data sharing initiative. There have been initiatives from the government, from law enforcement. But as you say, the key issues that popped up is not really the technical part, but it's the legal part. So the legal grounds on which we can do this. Although in cybersecurity, for instance, if you look to the intelligence sharing of cyber attacks, that's already existing for decades. So we are doing that in the cyberspace. But on frauds and between banks, that has been non-existing here. But when you look to the PSR regulation, which is upcoming, and where the final text will probably will be landing in the next coming weeks, you will find that clause that it will make it mandatory, in fact, to share these indicators of fraud or fraud intelligence between the financial institutions to be quicker in detecting fraud and stopping criminals when they pop up at one of the banks. But the key thing is here to provide the legal guarantees and the rules of the game. So we're working with all the partners in the ecosystem, being the telcos, the banks, the law enforcement, government, the regulators, to set up a scheme with a governance where it's clear what the rules of the game are, and who can consume which kind of data for what kind of purposes. Another thing which we have to do, and that's similar to cyber threat intel, so we need to speak a common language, so to automate it. And that's where we're working on creating a standard taxonomy on the types of fraud, but also then in the next phase describing what they call the TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. So how is that attack performed, so that you can technically describe this and then share it with other financial institutions, which they can automatically use in their risk engines and know how this kind of attack can be detected. So in that sense, fraud intelligence becomes much more actionable by using that common language. And so these are the key things to do.
Is this initiative local or is it global? Because a lot of the fraud will just surely shift across borders. So the kind of things that you're talking about with the common taxonomies and things like that, are those global initiatives?
Well, so we started for the taxonomy also from the EBA taxonomy. And so there are European initiatives to set up national sharing platforms. And so we want to be part of that network so we can also internationally connect. But we're starting now first on a national level, taking into account PSR and the European initiatives to at a later stage connect to that network and also collaborate in that sense. There is also global initiatives, like you might have seen the Global Signal Exchange, which was funded by Google and Microsoft. But there, the difficulty is the same as like with GDPR. So where is the data going? Where is it hosted? So I think for some data, phishing domains, malicious domains, that's fine. But if we're talking about IBAN numbers, mule accounts, personal information, that becomes more difficult to share it on a global stage where, let's say, the legal base is different in different regions.
It's an ongoing challenge there. Changing the line of questioning, a key theme that we see emerging is the shift from reactive fraud handling to proactive and continuous fraud intelligence. How do you see banks evolving from blocking bad transactions to continuously spotting and managing risk across their payment data, particularly in a real-time environment?
So what we're doing there, so indeed, we come from a rule-based approach, a fixed rule-based approach, which is typically based on your own knowledge about incidents that already happened. So that's always in a reactive mode. And that's also where we are starting to implement AI, but with human oversight. So what we're doing is we're starting to put it there in a passive way. That means it tells us what kind of anomalies it sees in the payment flows, and which sometimes are very difficult or impossible to be detected by a human analyst in a manual way. But then the analyst will analyze that anomaly and then confirm whether it's actually fraud or not to improve our learning model. And then when we see that our false positive rate is acceptable, then we might translate that to a rule. The second part is, of course, looking back to the previous point, is integrating the data sharing, the fraud indicators coming from other institutions, because if one financial institution has, for instance, detected a mule account, well, it's a mule account for everybody. So instead of doing that peer-to-peer and then using it as a community model, then we can act much, much more faster.
Real time is something that, everybody wants everything to be done now and fast. But real time payments creates this tension between speed and safety, or convenience and safety as well. How do you suggest banks approach that latency constraint for real time risk scoring while still enabling and allowing intelligent friction like dynamic delays and cooling off periods and that kind of a thing? How are you approaching that at the moment?
Yeah, there is indeed this tension between delivering the SLA of an instant payment and making sure that the necessary checks are done in terms of detecting fraud. What we are doing there, especially as we are in a business where we have like huge amounts passing through our system, is we are applying exactly the same checks and rules on instant payments. With that difference is that when we see that it's an instant payment for our analysts, the priority will be on top of the queue. So we treat them with priority. But we do sometimes pause payments, which are instant payments. And what we actually see is when we call the customer and we explain that it might be actually a fraudulent transaction, and it happens to be a fraudulent transaction, they're quite happy. We had a case a few weeks ago where they literally said, if you wouldn't have paused the transaction or blocked the transaction, we would have gone bankrupt. So we got a huge bouquet of flowers here for our team. And that's a customer that will never leave. So also for the customers, it's important that security is there and that there is this oversight. They're happy that we're doing it. And sometimes that means a little bit of delay on the payment. But we do apply the same screening and oversight on the instant payments there.
Interestingly, I know you were on the webinar that we had recently with Yuri Abraham from GASA. I had a follow-up interview with him last week just to pose him a couple of more audience questions. And we were talking about investment scams. And he said that at the moment, quite often, the bank is seen to be the bad guys when the bank phones the customer and says, "We've put a stop to your transaction because we think that it's fraudulent." And the scammers are now warning the customers in advance, saying, the bank doesn't want you to make money. We're offering you 100% return on your investment in 30 days. So when the bank phones you, this is how you must answer to the bank, because don't worry, the bank's only blocking the transaction because they don't really want you to make money. It's ridiculous. And I don't know how we would ever combat something like that. So
That's indeed. It's sometimes difficult, especially for those kind of frauds where customers are sometimes convinced that it's a real investment. We also try to get artifacts like the mails they got and so on, and prove them that it's coming from a malicious domain and it was not a real company, to explain them that it's a scam. But indeed, you sometimes have customers that are hard to convince that it's fraud, and then finally it's the customer that decides whether he goes on with a payment or not. We also at that point we see that sometimes customers are hesitant to believe that they have our analysts on the line, because you have to scam calls like, I'm from the bank. So if we call like, we are from the fraud department from Isabel, saying like, really? So we are also implementing, just like other banks, a system where you can check whether you're actually on the line with our fraud analyst, yes or no, whether there's a phone call, to check and to give that certainty again that you are really in contact with our customer service.
We're also seeing a bit of a trend within the banks that they're moving towards integrated financial crime operating models that combine fraud, AML, sanctions, and everything all into a single function. Firstly, are you actually seeing that trend yourself? And from a solution provider perspective, what does it take on the data and platform side to support that kind of a convergence?
Yeah. So as I explained already before, so we're not looking at atomic payments anymore. We're looking at signals from the telco networks. We have to spot fraud with contextual data, with looking at malicious domains, working with government security agencies to block domains and with the telco. So there's an overlap between cybersecurity and fraud, definitely. And we're trying to combine this in this ecosystem solution for data sharing and signal sharing, and also taking actions, making sure that we can block those infrastructures, and also warn customers when they are using or being redirected to malicious pages. So that's where we were working with different parties, and just like I said, also with remote access tool providers, providing all these signals and making sure that community collaboration is there, and that we leverage on the strength of the community.
So I'm going to ask you one final question to wrap up, and it's going to be forward-looking. If you look 3 to 5 years ahead, and the only reason why I say that far ahead is I know things take a long time in banking, where do you see the most significant innovation gaps and opportunities in using payments data and shared intelligence to combat fraud in the Benelux market? Final words.
I think 3 points there. Data sharing, fraud intelligence sharing is becoming important to act fast, because also criminals are very creative, and to circumvent, like we said, on the verification of PE and the e-invoicing, they find ways around it very fast. So we need to act fast and leverage on the community intelligence. So just like we did in cybersecurity, where we have like a cyber threat intel sharing for already decades, we need to do that for intelligence. A second one is the use of AI with human oversights to increase our detection capabilities, finding new patterns, finding new anomalies, getting more investigation tools, so that we can detect those early on in the stage and update our risk engines. And a third one for me is the point of the use of digital identity. So we have ADAS in Europe, where in the first stage in the last 10 years, we have been implementing digital IDs like It's Me in Belgium. So 8 million people already on an individual level are using digital identities, facilitating KYC process in a digital way, but also providing the guarantee that the data is verified and that it's not self-declared. And we're now getting into a second phase where we're doing that the same on corporate level, providing corporate verified data, and that's what Cube KYC at Isabel is doing. So that's your corporate identity, which might be used to onboard with banks, when you do supplier onboarding, to check whether that's a legitimate company, whether it's e-tendering. So there's multiple use cases and processes where we can get this integrated into providing more security on the actual identity and the data of the company.
Fantastic. Great summary. Easy 3 points to remember for the future. Remy, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon to see how we're managing to fight fraud in the Benelux region. Thank you.
Thank you very much.